Honourable Senators, I rise today to speak to the second reading of Bill C-39, a bill to delay by 1 year the repeal of the exclusion of mental illness as a sole underlying cause from eligibility for assisted suicide. This Trudeau government's 2021 decision to extend assisted suicide to people who are mentally ill is nothing short of abhorrent. Since the government expanded the eligibility for assisted suicide from people at end of life to those not facing imminent death, Canadians have witnessed the slippery slope rapidly becoming reality. We have seen it in the news. Multiple veterans offered medically assisted death instead of help from the government. Disabled and impoverished Canadians who feel they have no other option but to end their lives through assisted suicide because of a lack of health and social supports. The Parliamentary Committee on MAID recommends the expansion of assisted suicide to children. In recent weeks, I saw Twitter posts from the Federal Department of Justice actually promoting the virtues of medical assistance in dying. Meanwhile, psychiatric experts warn repeatedly about the dangers of expanding assisted suicide to people suffering from mental illness, and health practitioners state they're not prepared to do it. Rather than heed the dire warnings and apply the brakes, this activist Trudeau government has opted instead for this bill, a 1-year delay in implementation. They want to use the time to sell the awful concept of assisted suicide for mental illness to the Canadian public. But Canadians are waking up to the reality of the expansion of assisted suicide, and they are shocked and alarmed at the prospect of it being extended for mental illness. A recent Angus Reid survey found that only 31% of Canadians support this move. It was only 7 years ago that assisted suicide even became legal in Canada. I have been fighting against its expansion into mental illness since before the first legislation, C-14, was introduced in 2016 in response to the Supreme Court of Canada's 2015 Carter ruling. Fighting against the expansion of assisted suicide to people with mental illness was what first prompted me to start my social media accounts. My very first Twitter and Facebook posts were my national column on the issue entitled, "Help the Mentally Ill, Don't Kill Them." In 2019, a Quebec lower court ruled in the Truchon case that the federal criminal court provisions requiring that natural death be reasonably foreseeable and the Quebec assisted dying law provision that a person be at the end of life to qualify were invalid. Rather than appeal the ruling, as would usually be done, the Trudeau government instead chose to introduce new legislation, Bill C-7, to remove not only the reasonably foreseeable criterion, but also some minimal safeguards that had accompanied Bill C-14. Initially, the bill contained an exclusion for mental illness as a sole underlying cause of accessing MAID, but it was actually, shamefully, the Senate that passed a Sunset Clause amendment to end that exclusion in 18 months, thus throwing open the gates of assisted suicide to those suffering with mental illness. The government accepted that amendment, but modified the delay to 2 years. Even though the subject matter of the bill was studied by the Senate Legal Committee twice, once at pre-study, then again during study of the actual bill, the Mental Illness Sunset Clause, and thereby the extension of MAID to vulnerable Canadians with mental illness, was never examined by a committee in either House. The government established a committee to study how to implement the inclusion of psychiatric illnesses, not to judge the merits of whether to do so. And a parliamentary committee studied the further expansion of assisted suicide, including the issues of advance consent and extending MAID to minors. As is so often the case throughout this process, this activist Trudeau government has prioritized pure ideology over evidence, but the government continues to push its agenda anyway. Mental illness is not irremediable, one of the primary criteria to qualify for assisted suicide. Recovery, or at least the alleviation of suffering, is possible and can't be predicted. Expert psychiatrists recognize that the trajectory of mental illness is unpredictable. Dr. John Marr, a veteran psychiatrist who has worked with patients with some of the most severe resistant cases of mental illness, testified at the Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying, quote, "I defy literally any psychiatrist to say that this particular patient has an irremediable illness, because you can't. I have patients who get better after 5 years, after 10 years, and after 15 years. You cannot do it. It's guesswork. If you're okay with guesswork, if you're okay with playing the odds, or if your position is let's respect autonomy at all costs, if someone wants to die, they can die, call it what it is. It's facilitated suicide," unquote. Colleagues, often finding the right treatment for an individual is a process of narrowing down the combination of medications over time. Advocates of psychiatric-assisted suicide have recently begun to turn their argument from one of irremediability to that of inaccessibility as irremediability. That is pretty mind-blowing when you consider the state of Canada's healthcare system at the moment and how inaccessible doctors and treatments are for Canadians. Dr. John Marr reacted to one such claim at the MAID committee when another psychiatrist stated she would consider a patient facing a long waiting list for treatment as irremediable on that basis. Quote, "It's actually been said out loud, we'll let people die. We've seen in the news, let people die because they can't get an apartment." Irremediability, on my understanding of the Supreme Court ruling and subsequent legislation, had nothing to do with psychosocial resources. We were talking about diseases. These were medical diseases, brain diseases we're talking about now, where we couldn't medically treat them. Boy, has the barn door been opened wide here if that counts as irremediable. I'm going to cite this as a specific example of my great fear of the abuses that are going to follow with this legislation because there's no oversight. If a psychiatrist is going to let someone die because they can't get a treatment that will help them, then I'm frankly just shocked. That is not what this law is about, nor should it be. If we as a Canadian society are willing to let people die over apartments, I'm frankly just disgusted. Forgive my passion here, but you're parliamentarians with a duty to preserve life." Unquote. As many of you know, I am a family survivor of suicide loss. My husband, MP Dave Batters, died by suicide days short of his 40th birthday after struggling with depression and anxiety. I have seen up close the failures of our mental health care system. There are problems of accessibility, cost, stigma, and an utter lack of resources that stand in the way of people getting the help they need. The answer to those barriers is to fix that system, not to confirm a mentally ill patient's feelings of hopelessness and offer them the lethal means to suicide. The answer is certainly not to end their lives for them. As a compassionate society, we have an obligation to hold hope for Canadians with mental illness when they don't have any hope for themselves. In the limited time I have left, I did want to address some of the specious claims that governments and proponents of psychiatric MAID expansionism are making because they are misleading, and I think parliamentarians and Canadians should know this. First, in trying to sell the concept of psychiatric MAID to the Canadian public, Justice Minister David Lametti has implied that extending assisted suicide to people with mental illness has been mandated by the courts. This is simply not true. Neither the Carter nor the Truchon cases ruled on the constitutionality of expansion for mental illness, and neither plaintiff requested MAID based on psychiatric grounds. The government and proponents of psychiatric MAID try to draw a false equivalence between physical and mental illnesses. However, the two are very different. A mental illness is not terminal. Death is not its reasonably foreseeable outcome. Again, mental illness is not irremediable, and it is unpredictable, even for expert psychiatrists extensively trained to assess and diagnose those illnesses. Further, suicidality can be a symptom of mental illness. This is something I have unfortunately witnessed firsthand. To evaluate physical and mental illnesses as not identical is not discriminatory. It is simple acknowledgement of fact. As Dr. Sonu Gain testified before our Senate Legal Committee, quote, "It is not discriminatory to consider the particular nuances of mental illness in MAID discussions. Equity does not mean everything is the same. It means treating things fairly and impartially," unquote. We should not extend assisted suicide on psychiatric grounds if we cannot give Canadians with mental illness full access to treatment and support options. Honourable Senators, we cannot just throw up our hands at the gaps in our mental health care system and sign a death warrant to ease people's pain, congratulating ourselves with a delusion that we do it out of a twisted sense of equality. This is not equality for people with mental illness. It is a complete dereliction of our duty as parliamentarians. There are gaps in the mental health care system, and they are causing such suffering that people with mental illness are considering death rather than the further pursuit of treatment. The massive problems in our mental health care system make me angry. I've seen it, I've lived it with my husband. The fact that this Trudeau government will offer people death before addressing their need for treatment makes me livid. We as parliamentarians have a responsibility to do something about it, honourable senators, and it starts at the top with holding this government accountable. The Trudeau government, in its signature style, talks pretty words about mental health but does not follow through. In the 2021 election, the Liberal platform promised a Canada mental health transfer of $4.5 billion over 5 years. Here we are. nearly 18 months later, with one budget down and one on the way. And how much of that money for mental health has actually begun flowing? Not one red cent. According to the deadlines in their own Liberal campaign platform, this government is already more than $1.5 billion behind on their mental health care promises. How many wait lists for psychiatric care will that help alleviate, honourable senators? How many Canadians with mental illness will that provide with treatment or testing or medications? Oh, that's right, 0. This government thinks they can put out a couple of tweets on Bell Let's Talk Day, voice empty promises on mental health funding, and never follow it up with action. Honourable senators, I know many of you have your hearts in the right place, but if you really want to help people suffering with mental illness, why are you letting the government continue to get away with this? Why have you voted to give people with mental illness death before adequate supports? When this measure to extend assisted suicide was added by this chamber at the end of the Bill C7 process, so that it has never had proper review before a parliamentary committee in either House of Parliament, why aren't we forcing this bill to go through an intensive study now? Why is the only scrutiny this bill will receive going to be a 1-hour committee of the whole split between 2 ministers? Bill C-39 will pass. Those who want psychiatric MAID will vote for it, and those who vehemently oppose psychiatric MAID will vote for this bill to at least delay its enactment. We should be using the year of this delay to finally and honestly review whether it is right to expand assisted dying to people with mental illness, not how to implement killing them. Minister of Justice Lametti says he intends to use this year delay in implementing psychiatric MAID to, quote, allow everyone to internalize the standards and allow universities to prepare teaching materials and develop explanations, unquote. What a load of bunk. This government recognizes the tide is turning against this awful expansion, and they're hoping this delay will give them more time to do a sell job to Canadians. Honourable senators, this 1-year delay is needed today because Canada is not ready to extend assisted suicide to people living with mental illness. Psychiatrists and doctors are not ready. They are not comfortable with this because extending assisted suicide to mentally ill patients contradicts the standard of mental health care, which is suicide prevention and the preservation of hope and life. Canadians are also not ready for this. They're not comfortable with it because they're now witnessing in real time the nightmare scenarios that expanding assisted suicide so quickly have already caused. The rest of the world looks at our assisted suicide regime with shock. We've become the most permissive country on the planet. If everyone's uncomfortable with it, it's probably a good indication we're doing something wrong, honourable senators. We need to stop this runaway train before it's too late. The 1-year delay in Bill C-39 is a start, but it's only a start. The federal government needs to use this year to completely reevaluate extending assisted suicide for mental illness. They have gone too far with this ideological experiment and are headed straight for the abyss. It has gone too far for psychiatrists, it has gone too far for Canadians, and it's hurting most the people who desperately need us to continue to preserve hope for them, people living with mental illness. One of them, noted Canadian mental health advocate Mark Hennick, put it this way, quote, to expand medical assistance in dying solely for a mental illness would be the ultimate expression of systemic stigma and discrimination against people with mental illnesses. It would represent a final, preventable indignity to people who have been fighting for their right to recover, sometimes for a very long time, in spite of failing government healthcare systems which too often make recovery harder than it needs to be. It is unacceptable for lawmakers to abdicate their responsibility to some Canadians, those of us with a mental illness, and to wash their hands of their end of the social contract. We will not be so summarily culled by people in power who seem to see us as a systemic burden. People who have experienced a mental illness pay taxes too and are valuable members of Canadian society. We will not let you let us down, unquote. Honourable senators, we must not let them down. Thank you.